This little jet setter kicked off my journaling this week and was inspired by James chapter 4, verses 13 to 17. It reads, "Now listen, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why, you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them." I don't believe that the problem is that she's a planner. Rather, it's that she leaves God out of her plans. She's oblivious to her utter dependence on Him and unconcerned with God's will for her life. I wanted my entry to inspire a constant prayer life, this communication with my Creator throughout my day, and taking the time to consider His will when making any plans, just like an obedient child would do with their loving parents. So I Googled the word jet setter and I found this image to suggest a busy, crowded, hurried life pursuing worldly pleasures. And this is going to be my visual reminder. Verses 1 through 6 in chapter 5 continue with the consequences of dismissing or ignoring God and His will for believers. James is addressing those who hoard their wealth. As examples, he mentions failing to pay workers they've hired and the heartless practice of not only condemning but also murdering the innocent while living in complete luxury and self-indulgence. I illustrated the situation with a corroding heart in the chest of a man that's clutching onto his wealth. And reflecting on this as I journaled led me to pray for a heart to live generously and to love others better. And this is my reminder. I've developed this habit of sharing a demo each week with my journey through James, and this is the one that I captured this week. Patience for Jesus' return. I started by sketching this farmer in his field with pencil. I mixed then yellow ochre, raw umber, and permanent rose, which are yellow and yellow-brown with a pinky red. And I mixed them with water to create a flesh tone and painted his skin first, since that's the lightest part of my entry. Next, I'll paint a base layer for my background using a watered-down mixture of light yellow, green, and tan. This will serve as the highlights or the lightest part of the farmer's field. I'm lifting up my sketchbook so that gravity can help me as I guide the paint to the areas I want to cover. And notice that even when I tip my page like this, the paint won't move into the dry areas. It's only when I wet the page with my brush that the paint moves. But I do have to work quickly so that those edges of water don't start drying and leave harsh color lines where I want a smooth blend of color. Because I do want a sharp edge for the horizon line, I'll dry this section before painting the adjoining sky to keep those colors from bleeding together. Then I'm going to turn my book around upside down to pull the blue sky paint from the horizon to the edge of my page, and again lift it up to help the paint move. This also helps prevent paint from pooling in areas, which can create mushroom-like effects and strange lines. And sometimes that's okay. In fact, you might even want to try splattering some clean water on an area you've painted to create a different texture. I'm using a Kleenex to dab off paint in a section of the sky to create a cloud there. And once I get the main section painted, I can go back and fill in the smaller area that's separated by his arm. Once I let this dry, I can start painting in rows of crops. I'm going to use a fan brush for this. It's one I've modified by cutting some of the bristles to create jagged edges. I'll mix a little darker green in the background and just dab it onto the page to represent these seedlings that will end up bearing a crop. Once I dry that, I'll add some more of the sap green to darken the next layer. And then I'll come in with dabs of light brown to indicate the dirt between the rows. Again, I'll let all that dry, then pass over with a darker green. Since green is a blend of blue and yellow, I can create a darker green with different blues and yellow combinations, or I can just use the same combination I've been using but with less water, which of course dilutes the color. If I want an even darker green, I can paint directly from the tube of paint, or I could add a little black or neutral tint to my green. Neutral tint's a gray, it's a natural gray that darkens or tones down whatever color it's mixed with. Adding the first layer of brown dirt really helps define my rows, and I'm not really being real accurate with my plants. My goal is just to convey the idea of crops and create some depth by doing it in layers. I'll even add a second layer of brown dirt too, and then let the whole thing dry before working on the farmer. I'm choosing Payne's Gray for his pants, which has a lot of blue tones in it and will look more like jeans, I hope. I really should have painted his shirt first, but I didn't decide to make it yellow until after I finished his pants. So when I paint the bottom edge of the shirt, it's possible that the darker blue paint from his pants could reactivate enough to bleed into the yellow slightly. Notice that when I do paint his shirt that I'm using a big bellied brush full of paint, and that I'm not tilting the page to help the paint flow and to help move it along. Because of that, the paint pooled in areas and kind of dried unevenly. I hope you can see the difference where I dragged the paint down the top arm smoothly, but other areas that were saturated caused them to dry that way. That wasn't my intention, by the way. It just wasn't thinking ahead. The blue pants were actually a combination of cerulean blue that I used for the sky and Payne's Gray, and now I'm going to add more of the dark Payne's Gray to the mix to paint the hat. I'll be sure that's completely dry, then I'll use a smaller brush for details to dab in some burnt umber for hair peeking out from under the hat. That'll finish my illustration. Most of the time, I will write the verse out in pencil to get a feel for spacing and to make sure it's going to fit. And that also allows me to practice whatever lettering style I'm going to use. But in this case, I opted to just go for it, using a Tombow soft tip brush pen. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. I knew the verse was going to cover the sky and extend down into the crops, but once it was there, I felt like the words got kind of lost in the dark background. To fix that, I added some highlights around the letters with a white Jelly Roll pen. It's still not great, but I thought I could live with it. I shifted gears and started outlining the farmer. I always love the way the black contrast makes the colors pop and defines all the details. But in this case, despite all the joy of outlining, it didn't change the fact that the verse still was not as visible as I'd like. So plan B, I'm going to apply some white gouache to tone down the blur. Plan B, I'm going to apply some white gouache to tone down and blur the background. Gouache is closely related to watercolor, but it has more pigment and it's opaque. So unlike the transparency of watercolors, full-strength gouache can completely cover the layers below it. I'm adding some water, so hopefully it'll just lighten and obscure the background enough so that the verse will be more prominent. That was pretty tedious with poor results, so I decided I'd just paint over the whole section of that verse, first with the white gouache mixed with water. My Tombow pen isn't quite waterproof, so it created a bit of a gray tone, so I let that layer dry and then did a second one with white gouache mixed with just a little of the yellow ochre to help it blend a little bit and not stand out as so white. Once everything finished drying, I added the verse again, and hopefully this little exercise will help me avoid that problem in the future. I always like to share my mistakes, so hopefully you can avoid making the same ones. I dabbed a little color around the verse and tidied up some of the details to finish up this entry. And then my last entry for the week, I went on to James 5 verses 8 and 9, which say, "You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door." I reflected on these verses and debated about whether to create one or two entries and whether I wanted to focus on the grumbling, the standing firm, or Jesus as judge standing at the door. Well, I ended up going with standing firm upon the rock, which of course represents Jesus. I took my time building up multiple layers on that rock to create it and then sketched in a climber standing firm on it. Because I once went in search of tutorials for painting a rock for my journaling, I let the camera roll and made a separate video on my channel of the process for this one if you're interested. And there you go. That's all my journaling for this week. Thank you for letting me share it with you. I sure hope you're journaling as well, and I wish I could see what you were up to. But anyway, have a blessed week, and I'll see you next week. We're getting close to the end of the book of James, so take care.